Ryan, you've done a lot of work studying the German church, specifically early mid 1900s, and the Christian leaders in the German church, their response to the rise of Adolf Hitler and like fascism, Nazism. What were some of what drew you to that field of study, and what were some of the things that you've taken away from it?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. What drew me to it? Well, I don't know. I always tell people, when I, like any self-respecting evangelical in college, I came across Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, which are two names that maybe some of your listeners will know, really important theologians in the 20th century. And in particular, I read Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship. And this rocked my world, of course, as it will. And so I said, "Oh, amazing! I'm going to go write a PhD on Bonhoeffer." And then, as I started to look at PhD programs, I realized that I wanted to write a PhD on Bonhoeffer, and so did everybody else who has ever lived. And so there wasn't a lot of terrain left to cover, and I wasn't smart enough to do it. So as I was looking for potential programs, I got in contact with the woman who ended up being my doctoral supervisor at the University of Edinburgh, a scholar of Judaism and the Holocaust named Hannah Holtschneider. And she said, "Well, hey, have you looked at these figures on the other side, right? The sort of
Hmm.
anti-Bonhoeffer. Have
Hmm.
you looked at folks who were sympathetic to Nazism, for example? A lot less work has been done on them, and there's good reasons for that. They're a bit more sinister in some cases, and they ended up being on the wrong side of history, of course. So that's how I ended up there. Never intended to, but it ended up being a really fruitful study. And one of the big takeaways uh, I came away with is that there was no one Christian response to the
Hmm.
rise of fascism in Germany and also in elsewhere. This is happening in a few different places in Europe in the 20th century. And really, what I came to see is that the church fragmented here basically into three factions. You had one group called the Deutsche Christen. That's what they called themselves, the German Christians, who were really enthusiastic about the Nazi Party platform, really had a sort of infatuation with the person of Hitler, um, and really put themselves at the service of the Nazi government in the early 1930s. Then you had a group that kind of crystallized on the other side, and some of your listeners might be familiar with the Confessing Church. These are pastors and theologians who uh, protested against National Socialist interference with church affairs and ended up resisting Nazism to various degrees. And then I think your largest percentage is a kind of unaffiliated middle who are basically conservative politically, conservative theologically, conservative culturally, and were sort of fine to go along with National Socialism. Some of them changed their minds later on. And I looked at some figures kind of in that middle too. And so there was no one Christian response.
Hmm. So I think for me, most of my engagement with the rise of Nazism is like movies, maybe a book here and there. Uh, how long was that process? So you're thinking about average churchgoers. Like, how long was the time from like maybe when Hitler enters the scene, the Nazism enters the scene, to where you get to like World War II stuff? I mean, is
Mm-hmm.
is the church marinating in this for a long time, or is this all of a sudden it just hits the church?
Yeah, good question. So to answer that question, you've got to back up a little bit. Um, I mean, in the 19th century, Germany is a great imperial power and a monarchy, and really is a sort of golden age culturally for Germans, and by and large, theologians, churchmen, Christians in Germany are prefer that style of government. Um, and then after the First World War, um, which has all kinds of crazy aftermath that really shapes the mood in Germany in the 20s. But after the First World War, that monarchy is dissolved
Hmm.
and a democracy is put in its place called the Weimar Republic. Um, and it was Germany's first experience, an experiment with a democratic style of government. And the results were mixed. Obviously, the economy was in a tailspin. We complain about inflation now,
Hmm.
and inflation is bad, but we don't have to have like literally a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread, right? So that's the kind of inflation you're dealing with. So there's some dissatisfaction there, and largely Christians are critical of the Weimar Republic, and that's because they've inherited a Lutheran political theology dating back to the 16th century, in which Luther taught that basically God is administering his reign over the world through two kingdoms, the right hand kingdom and the left hand kingdom. The right hand kingdom is through spiritual rule, word and sacrament. And the left hand kingdom is through political powers, state powers. And of course, in Luther's context, this is a prince, right? And so Lutherans have this strong affinity in Germany for that style of government, and they're very, very suspicious of democracy. Another reason they're suspicious of the Weimar Republic is you get some sort of liberal values, and I mean liberal in the broadest sense of that term,
Hmm.
right? Lowercase l. So a lot more sort of cultural freedoms, and so, for example, immigration rises during the Weimar Republic. You get a bustling gay scene in Berlin and other big cities, and Christians are nervous about this too. You're also getting a rise of sort of pluralism now, not like you and I know it, but there's in the 1920s an increased interest in sort of Eastern thought and Eastern religion. So some of that is finding its way in, and this is all conspiring to create a real sense of unrest. The
Hmm.
Weimar Republic was really unstable from the beginning, and it only lasted 12 years. Now, Hitler was democratically elected, and then took a number of steps to basically um, dissolve the democratic apparatuses that had put him in power. And that happens in the early 1930s. And by and large, most Christians are fine with it
Hmm.
because they think that the democratic government is inconsistent with God's design for how countries are supposed to run, and they think it's inconsistent with the German spirit.
So you have this kind of this theological foundation of that comes from Luther, where the idea is, yeah, God's rule and reign is through the church for our souls, and then through the prince or through the palace for affairs of state, managing our common life together, running the what we might say like running the country or
Mm-hmm.
running the city or running the government. And so that is all in the water. So the average churchgoer, just that's what they're swimming in. That's what grandma used to say. It's when we do our Bible studies on, Wednesday nights. That's we are all thinking by and large that that's kind of how things should work. And here we are now, post World War One, wheelbarrow full of money. Things suck, right? And there's all these strange people coming into my country. There's all these aberrations from what I would argue are biblical norms. So you've got, homosexuality now, not just as an idea, but there's clubs, Ryan. My goodness,
Mm-hmm.
there's clubs down. I walked down the street the other day to go to the grocery store, and there's a gay club on the scene. So, and there's all these immigrants on the street. So this anxiety around pluralism
Mm.
is stirring up in the church in the 1920s. Here's this democratically elected leader that's saying things that I like. What are they hearing from the Hitler-esque talk track that they're liking?
Yeah, so a couple of important things here, which you've summarized very well. There's a scholar named Mel Gordon who has written a book about the Weimar Republic called amazing title, Voluptuous Panic, uh, which really captures it, right?
Oh man, that sounds like
Uh,
an emo band from the early 2000s.
Voluptuous Panic at the Disco. Uh, and so for example, one of the theologians I worked on was a guy named Paul Althaus, who's not a household name. There is no need for any of your listeners to read him, nor could they. He's not really translated. It's fine. But why he's such an instructive example is he's not a fanatical fascist or anything like this. He's just a sort of conservative Lutheran who is really concerned about what he's seeing in his country, right? And you named a few of them, right? So you've got changing sexual mores, which is really disorienting for people. He's very concerned with immigration. In particular, he's really concerned with sort of people who look German but aren't. And by this, he means Jews in particular. And he's concerned with people coming and speaking other languages that are not German, right? So he's worried about this. And he's worried about sort of this bucolic sense of Germanness, right? People who are connected to the land and to nature, that's changing under urbanization and mass immigration. So he's really disoriented by all this, right? And so I think the other big piece we need to understand, if we're going to understand the initial support and appeal of Hitler, is these folks, these theologians in particular, and presumably Christians on the ground, really believe that Germany is a Christian nation. And they don't just mean this culturally, right? They don't mean this in terms of civil religion. So this theologian Althaus, but others like him, said that every people group, every ethnic group has, and the term he uses in German is a term Seelentum, which is the German word for soul with a suffix that means like ness, Ness on the end. So soulness.
Hmm.
Every ethnic group has a distinct soulness. It's who they are ontologically at the level of their being. And he thinks Germans are Christians at the level of Seelentum. It's just who they are.
Hmm.
And so if you believe that, then all these cultural changes are doubly distressing, because it's not only sort of culturally disturbing, but it's actually corrupting something in the essence of the German spirit for him, right? So Hitler comes along, and now the degree to which Hitler has any sort of actual Christian sympathies is hotly contested. There's some scholars who think that when Hitler speaks Christian, he means it, or at least part of him means it. There's another school of thought that thinks that this is just a cynical political ploy and he's just pandering to a base. I'm inclined to agree with the second interpretation more than the first, but there's lots of debate on that. But Hitler comes along and he starts saying things like, we're going to restore Christianity to its place of privilege in German culture. We're going to restore the church as a center of cultural respect, as an institution of allegiance. We are going to do something about immigration. We're going to do something about these aberrant sexual subcultures which are developing. And this is where his rhetoric about the Jews becomes important, because in the sort of, I think in the cultural imagination, not just in Germany, but really everywhere in Western Europe, from about the 18th century on, Jews are associated with all of these forms of deviancy. So they're thought to be behind these sexual changes. They're thought to be running the media. They're thought to be pulling all the strings in big business and banking. And so Hitler comes along and says, hey, things were not so bad when Jews were not running all of this stuff, but now look around, right? And many, many Christians were sympathetic to that messaging.
So you have average churchgoers showing up to their churches, wherever they're at, Berlin, whatever. And there's this undercurrent of first the ideology or the theology of the way that the state should work. It's an instrument from God. We need a prince. Our expectation, because we're a Christian people, is that our prince is Christian, and it's part of the German soul. So if you're German, you're Christian-ish, or part of our heartbeat is Christian. Even if you are atheistic-ish or agnostic-ish, still part of your Germanness is Christianity. So Christianity kind of becomes a component of one's ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be German is to be Christian. And there's all these aberrations from Christianity, which make me nervous. There's all these economical pain points that I'm experiencing, which probably, at least in my experience as a pastor, that actually makes people more upset than the threat of, spiritual pathogens. They're very much concerned about their bank account. And so here's this enemy, or these enemies, these others, and they're responsible for the pain that we're feeling, economically, the threat that we're feeling and the anxiety we're feeling theologically. And my pastor's telling me this. Is that right? Like, would my pastor or my priest be elevating this in their pulpit, in their sermon, in their Bible studies, or am I only hearing this from the government leadership?
Well, it certainly depends. And of course, there are pastors all over the spectrum here. But there's been lots of good scholarly work to show that this sort of rhetoric is circulating in parishes on the ground. Um, and even figures that we think of as sort of heroic, like Bonhoeffer, for example, who ends up uh, being quite outspoken, resisting Nazi policies on the so-called Jewish question. Even the early Bonhoeffer, like if you're looking at Bonhoeffer in the late 20s or even the early 30s, even he is saying something like, you know, the state is justified in taking some measures to restrict Jewish influence, for example.
Hmm.
And if that's true, then that's a pretty good indication that your average pastor uh, is is more or less going to be on board with this. Now, only the most extreme ideological sort of sympathizers would have really been supportive of anything like the final solution. That's very, very rare. Most Christians are appalled by this, when at least when all the details come to light.
Hmm.
But they are certainly comfortable with restricting Jewish civil liberties. They're really comfortable with removing Jewish pastors from leadership um, and excluding them from civil leadership as well.
So let's think on that just for a minute. So thinking about, if I'm an average churchgoer, I might say, "Hey, Ryan, you're coming to me in your time machine and you're judging me about the Holocaust and stuff. I didn't have
Mhm.
anything to do with the Holocaust. I would never agree to that. However, I'm cool with exclusion, I'm cool with othering, and I'm cool with removing certain civil liberties." What would you say to me there? How do those things work together? For instance, does the Holocaust happen without the majority of people saying we're kind of cool with the middle stuff?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to address because historical counterfactuals are always hard. So we're doing some conjecture here. Uh, Maybe some of your listeners would be familiar with a book by a man named Christopher Browning called "Ordinary Men." It actually, I think, became a bestseller. And in this book, Browning, who's a historian, shows that actually, when the Nazis started to implement the final solution, one of the ways they did this is through these special units called Einsatzgruppen, which were made up of volunteers, extermination squads, basically mobile extermination squads. And Browning is able to show that, in fact, they didn't really have to compel people to join these. Lots of people volunteered to join them. So it's a really chilling read because it suggests that actually ordinary people like you and me in the right toxic circumstances probably don't need a whole lot of goading to participate in atrocious evil, right? So there's this. Yeah, I mean, I really, for example, this theologian Paul Althaus, um, who I looked at most closely, after the Allies won the war, starting in the spring of 1945, and after they set up these tribunals called denazification councils, where people who were held any sort of civil office, which in Germany includes pastors and university professors, had to pass these panels and sort of defend their views and vindicate themselves of any complicity with Nazi ideology. And in these trials and in his personal correspondence, Althaus is basically saying, we never imagined it would become something like this. And in fact, he has a sermon from the spring of 1945 where he says, we thought we were opening the door to God. And in fact, that's what he called the rise of Hitler in 1933. He called it a gift and miracle of God. That's an
Hmm.
exact quote. Um, 12 years later, he says, no, we thought we were opening the door to God, but actually we let the devil in instead, he
Hmm.
says.
Hmm.
Um, and so Althaus reads it as the German church. well, the language he uses is he says we're not all guilty, but we all do bear shame for it, which
Hmm.
is a sort of maybe a bit of semantic gymnastics. But what he means is, well, I didn't perpetrate it, but maybe it doesn't happen if we act differently,
Hmm.
right? And so, does it happen? I think probably, just because National Socialism was extraordinarily successful in co-opting every other facet of German life. Now, the church was one. Um, but I will say, early National Socialism, at least, perpetrated terrible things with a veneer of respectability.
Hmm.
And part of that is because leading pastors and theologians uh, had lent some credibility to the
Yep.
regime.
So it sounds like, so yeah, one of the questions that maybe we're thinking through is if Adolf Hitler is taking this, he's on this trajectory to gain power, right? Government, state power, and he's got to appease the populace. And the majority of the people self-proclaim, self-identify as Christian because it's part of the soul of Germany. Uh, you can't just say, well, Christianity is stupid or irrelevant, because now you're disenfranchising the populace that you need to support you. And so you also want to do stuff that early on people don't want you to do, uh, perpetrate injustice. So you have to gain credibility. You got to earn co-signers. Like I remember the first time I took out a loan, I went to the
Hmm.
bank. I had no credit. I had not established my credibility. So I had to have one of my parents co-sign the loan, which said if he can't take care of it, we will. And you've got a political leader in Hitler who wants the clergy, pastors, who have all this capital with their congregations, to co-sign his behavior to create what you said, a veneer of respectability. And so while you don't have pastors saying, hey, let's do Holocaust stuff, let's do mass genocide, you do have some clergy and Christian leaders adding weight to the one who will do the evil destruction.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, maybe complicity might be a word. They didn't do the thing. They didn't stop it. They didn't speak against it. In fact, for many of them, they spoke positively of the person who was going to do it. Is that a fair assessment of the situation?
Yeah, and actually, it's a good insight you make. One very famous Holocaust scholar has said that these sort of moderating conservative Lutherans are actually the most evil characters in the church struggle, not because they were the most ideological or fanatical, but because they lent some sort of spiritual gravitas
Mm.
to National Socialism, which ended up being tremendously damaging in the end because uh, they're not the lunatic fringe, quote unquote, right? There are some theologians who are so desperate to sort of get behind the Nazi Party platform that they're producing very clearly insane scholarship. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's a prominent university in Germany in the 20th century called the University of Jena, and they found like a think tank called the Center for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German Church Life is the
Hmm.
name of it. And they're producing all kinds of scholarship that shows that Jesus, isn't actually Jewish. His father was a Gentile Roman
Mm-hmm.
soldier,
Mm-hmm.
and you can trace Jesus's bloodlines to the Aryan ethnic group. Obviously, that's insane, and it was seen as dubious scholarship at the time. All these respectable theologians say, obviously, that's crazy. That's not true. But Jews are a problem, right? So
Right.
you get it's actually almost more dangerous when you get serious. I mean, Althaus is not a big name now, but he was then. Um, when you get respected theologians and pastors, yeah, it did a lot of damage.
So these respected pastors and theologians, they're writing, they're preaching. Do you think in their minds this is political calculus? Meaning, we need to preserve the church, we need to preserve the integrity of Christianity in the German Volk, in the German people. Uh, maybe we don't like some of this stuff, but the ends justify the means. Do you sense that that was operating in some of their minds or their writing?
So certainly, although I don't think they are being cynical about it. So I don't think, for example, I didn't come across any figures who were sort of like, yeah, this is obviously evil and destructive, but it doesn't matter because it's going to elevate us to our place of prominence.
Mm-hmm.
There's not that sort of grifting, if I can put it like that.
Sure, right.
They're all absolutely convinced of the truth of the gospel and the truth of the Christian faith, and they think that their society will be better off with Christians in power, right? Which is a perfectly reasonable position to hold, if you ask me, right? What's interesting though is this figure that I looked at most closely. I was able to go to his university, and I got into his archive, and I had all of his personal papers, all of his correspondence.
Hmm.
And what's really interesting is I was looking at letters from like, oh, this is 1936, 37, 38, where things are really ramping up. And he's telling people privately that he doesn't like Hitler, doesn't like his style, thinks he's too extreme, uh, but he's sort of willing to live with it if he can have all these other gains. So at least in his instance, he's expressing one thing privately and sort of keeping silent publicly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've focused a lot on the baddies, or at least the ones who
Yeah.
gave rise to the baddies. You talked a little bit at the beginning about the confessing church. You mentioned a figure named Dietrich Bonhoeffer who was part of the confessing church. Who's Dietrich Bonhoeffer? What's the confessing church, and how did they respond?
Yeah. Uh, the Confessing Church started off as a group that called themselves the Emergency Pastors League. And they formed in the early 1930s as a response to what they saw as alarming political developments trending towards fascism. Um, and so there's a bunch of key names in the Confessing Church. The ones that are well known are Bonhoeffer, he already mentioned, who was a Lutheran pastor who held various posts in Germany, but also abroad, German-speaking congregations in Spain and England as well. Studied for a time in America, so and a theologian, absolutely brilliant mind, but also folks like Martin Niemöller. That's a name some people know. Another prominent pastor, and then Karl Barth is really the theological architect, who is not German but Swiss, but one of the key players here. And they organized themselves originally to defend against what they saw as the state's infringement on the domain of the church. So
Hmm.
part of this Lutheran political theology that we already mentioned is the two kingdoms doctrine. And what that is supposed to mean in its most pristine form is that God is orchestrating his reign through the left hand rule, which is a secular magistrate, a prince or a king or an emperor. And then he's administering his spiritual reign through his right hand rule, which is the church. And how this is supposed to work is that neither is supposed to impinge on the other, right? So princes are not supposed to tell the church what to do, right? And the church is not supposed to tell princes what to do. And they saw early Nazi overtures towards the church as infringing on that two kingdoms doctrine. So what they're protesting against, at least initially, is what they saw as the sort of government's attempt to co-opt the church. Sometimes the confessing church is sort of romanticized as sort of heroic protesters, and that might be true in the case of individual pastors, but it was mostly a movement to try to preserve the integrity of the church against government interference. It was not really outspoken in trying to defend the Jews or anything like this.
Hmm.
It was more about sort of the integrity of the two kingdoms doctrine.
So you've got this. division within the church in Germany between those who are state churches and those who are confessing churches. Tell us, as an American, I don't think we have state churches here.
Hmm.
What is that, and how's that distinct from a confessing church?
Yeah. So this is tricky for Americans to understand because the separation of church and state is woven right into our founding documents and has been a part of the American ethos from the very beginning. So we don't have state churches. What we mean by that is, although clergy and churches do get certain benefits and provisions in the tax code, they don't receive any sort of subsidies or anything from the government, right? So churches are independent in this sense. In Germany, and this is still the case, the EKD, the Evangelical Church in Germany, or the German Lutheran Church, is a state church, which means that pastors are state employees, as are university professors in the divinity school. And so that means that not only is their salary, but also their pension and all their benefits are administered by the state. So this is another factor that we have to take into account, that a lot of these pastors, for them to have taken a radical stance would have been to sacrifice their livelihood. Now,
Right.
some do. Bonhoeffer, for example, does sacrifice a part of his salary and shares it with a Jewish colleague who had been stripped of his pastoral position. Um, so the state church is a state sponsored church, state subsidized church, uh, and the confessing church. These pastors would have still been in state churches unless they sort of voluntarily disenfranchised themselves that way.
Uh, did the government like tell the church what to do? So, like, if I'm a pastor in 1925 Germany, is like my governor or mayor my boss?
Uh, I wouldn't put it like that. It would be like anywhere. I mean, say that in America we had some policy on the books, right at the level of policy, but you're a pastor, I don't know, in rural South Dakota. Like, who's really going to enforce that,
Okay.
right? And so a lot of, like, Niemöller, for example, could pastor in various rural contexts where there was not much oversight. Another theologian named Helmut Thielicke, who was a resistor, gets moved around to different parishes to escape that oversight. What it would look like more likely is if you're in a prominent pastorate, for example, like this fellow Althaus, who preaches at a prominent university chapel. We have record of the Gestapo sitting on his sermon. So the Gestapo is there. What they're checking for in his case is he was critical of the state's euthanasia program. So he gave some sermons that got him into hot water there, and the Gestapo started showing up in his sermons. So that could happen. Um, More likely, what these guys are protesting with the Emergency Pastors League is what they see as a fraudulent state church election. So you've got this big unified church that has one bishop at the top who presides over the entire German church. And in 1934, there's a really important election about who's going to be the bishop of the state church. And what they got fired up about is that Hitler's preferred candidate won, even though he was not qualified. And he was seen as sort of a shill
Mm-hmm.
who would support the party line, a guy named Ludwig Muller. So it was likely that interference really took place on that sort of high level plane.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in your studies, you're also pastorally minded, Ryan. And so, as we think about pastoring today, here we are in 2024 America. We see that political polarization is happening, political combativeness, people using God talk and Christian language to generate at least some kind of appeal to a Christian populace, not only in America, where you and I live, but also in other countries in Europe, South America, etc.
Mm.
What lessons pastorally can we learn for those of us who follow Jesus today when we encounter polarization, othering language, the nasty rhetoric that you saw in the 1920s and 30s? We kind of see some of that today. how would you shepherd us and our hearers as we're thinking through how do we faithfully follow Jesus today?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really difficult question. And just for a bit of context, I teach at a seminary, but I also pastor a church, and uh, I, I was serving as a shepherd to a congregation trying to go through COVID, where we felt a lot of this pain of the political polarization, and it was really
Hmm.
difficult for us, and I think for a lot of other churches, and very hard on your pastors those years. Um, a couple things I would say. I think part of what made the that period, the 1920s through the 1940s, so explosive is you had a sort of perfect storm, as you said, of economic and social and theological factors that were all converging, and it created conditions that were ripe for what one scholar has called the politics of cultural despair.
Hmm.
And that's one real clear parallel that I see, is that we are living in a moment of governed by politics of cultural despair.
Hmm.
And this is not just the case on the right, it's absolutely the case on the left. Um, both sides are using absolutely apocalyptic language, like the future of civilization is at stake,
Hmm.
right? Using lots of good and evil language, right? So, accordingly, our discourse has really devolved into a politics of grievance, right? And I think you're seeing this in two forms at least. You've got what you might call the rage of resentment on the right, which is we resent that this place is not how we remember it. Whether that place actually existed is another question, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But we resent that things are not as we remember them to be, or I think they should be. So you've got this really simmering rage of resentment. But then on the left, um, you've also got what I perceive to be this really disdainful contempt for
Hmm.
everybody else. Um, that manifests in sort of uh, all kinds of sort of moral speech policing, for example, and I know it's cliche, but canceling, for example. I think these are both sort of toxic fruits of the same taproot.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess I would say, I mean, I'm not a New Testament scholar, and I don't have Galatians 5 in front of me, but I'm pretty sure anger is not one of the fruits of the Spirit. You can double check me on that, Caleb. Um, I just think that gospel people are not to be rageful people. Now, that's not to say that you can't have legitimate concerns about the direction of the country. Of course, you can. Sure. It's not to say that you can't make moral judgments about political parties or candidates or whatever. Of course, you can and you must. Um, but resentment and contempt are not fruits of the Spirit,
Hmm.
right? And they can drive us to a kind of madness that few other things can,
Hmm.
right? And so when Althaus reflects back on those 12 years in that sermon to which I alluded earlier, he says, "What the only thing I can explain it with is that we became possessed
Hmm.
demonically as a
Hmm.
nation for 12 years, and that's because we didn't test the spirits, right? To use First John's language, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing I think I would say. Another, an important insight from Bonhoeffer in his book on ethics, which he was working on before he was executed. And this you can find this also in Luther. He's drawing this out of Luther. He's making a distinction between what he calls the penultimate and the ultimate. Uh, and the ultimate is the lordship of Jesus Christ and allegiance to Him and justification by faith. So anything that draws us into redemptive relationship with Jesus Christ, that's ultimate. That's what matters in the end.
Hmm.
The penultimate are things that matter but are passing away. And he puts politics here,
Hmm.
right? So I think a good deal of our dysfunction at the moment is that we have confused politics for an ultimate category. We've
Hmm.
taken something penultimate and made it ultimate. This happens also on the left and the right.
Yeah. Yeah, or perhaps we've merged them.
Ah,
That the way to get to the ultimate is through the highway of uh, political power.
Yeah, that's right.
I hear this a lot. We're going to take America back for God. And somehow the kingdom of God is woven into that idea that somehow we're going to get to the kingdom in its fullness, not by means of a cross, but by means of a sword, not by means
Mm,
of living the Sermon on the Mount, but by means of political dominance and power. And
hmm
so the objective or the end game is the same. The ultimate is the same. It's the how we're going to get there. I think that perhaps is the difference of conviction or perspective.
Yeah. I am thinking here of a remark that the New Testament scholar Rudolf Bultmann. Some listeners might know that name. He was a really influential figure in the 20th century. Continues to be influential. He was an acquaintance, a friend maybe of Althaus, and he sends this letter to Althaus in the early 1930s, and he says, "Hey, I'm really concerned about the direction that you're going. Because Althaus signed this document that said, "Hey, we should remove Jewish pastors
Hmm.
from their positions over German congregations," and it goes into all its reasons why. Um, and he basically thinks that a Jewish pastor in that cultural moment isn't going to be able to shepherd a German church because there's so much suspicion towards Jews. It's not like he thinks Jews should be persecuted exactly. He just thinks they won't be effective pastors. So he signs this document, and his friend Boltmann says, I'm really concerned that you sign this.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons I'm concerned is that um, it suggests to me that you have lost the conviction that the gospel is true enough and powerful enough and strong enough to achieve what you want to achieve. So you're having to use these other mechanisms, right? And I think
Hmm.
there's a pretty clear parallel here too. And I always want to be careful about drawing parallels because I think nuance is important.
Yeah.
But um, I don't know that there's a Christian out there who doesn't want to see the world more Christian, right? I don't think that there's a Christian out there who doesn't think that all people should know Jesus Christ and that they should live in the ways that God wants us to live. What I get concerned about is when we resort to sort of purely political mechanisms, does it suggest that we've lost our faith in the beauty and the power of the gospel?
Yeah.
That we just don't think that anyone can believe it, so we're going to sort of impose it
Yeah.
or legislate it.
Yeah. Yeah. The gospel is great for when things are fine, but Ryan, things are bad.
Yeah,
And there's an enemy out there.
yeah,
And it used to be easy, and so Christianity was good for like daily morality, but now
yeah.
things are collapsing.
Well, yeah, you get this sort of it's wartime rhetoric.
Yeah.
Well, you read the New Testament, it's always been wartime,
Right.
right? I mean, the
Yeah.
this is the Apostle Paul's arguably is his dominant motif is the battlefield,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
The difference is he says he doesn't deny that we're in a fight. And so when I have folks who come to me and say, "Hey, we're in a battle against the powers and principalities," I say, "Absolutely we are."
Right.
I don't disagree with you there,
Right.
right? But what Paul says to the Corinthians, I think, is an important word to the church today. He says, "Yeah, we're in a fight, but we don't wage war as
Right.
the world does,"
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So I don't deny that there's a war going on. I don't think there's any such thing as a neutral culture, and I don't think there's anything about being anything good about or possible about being culturally neutral either. I just think, on what terms are we fighting? Which weapons?
Yeah. Yeah, I've found that most religious nationalistic movements, Christian nationalistic in particular, they're very good around diagnosing
Hmm.
things that are broken. And I agree with much of their diagnoses. The prognosis is the problem. Like, how are we going to fix the thing? How are we going to see redemption and restoration and healing and people's body, mind, and soul restored and redeemed? And I think for those who would choose the political lane for that, as important as politics are,
Mm-hmm.
If we're placing our hope in some sort of legislative effort or political dominance to bring healing to the things that we find broken, I would just refer anyone who thinks that to world history and your Bible,
Mm-hmm.
because it just never works. It's all these promises that
Mm-hmm.
never come to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the Old Testament, man, like there's all these hopes that things are going to be good and we're going to get back to Eden. And there's all these kings that show up and are like, we can reestablish Eden, and it's just failure after failure. Even the good ones are epic failures.
Mm-hmm.
And that leaves us noticing, I think if we're reflective on the text, it leaves us noticing, I don't think political kings are going to get us back to Eden. We need another king. And the thing that's so revolutionary about Jesus is he's like, yeah, my kingdom doesn't do swords. We do crosses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way. And so the
Mm-hmm.
diagnosis may be right. Our political leaders, our politicized church leaders may be correct in noticing the broken things in the world. But the prognosis, if that doesn't sound like Jesus, it's only going to beget more broken things in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we love to point to Hitler and we love to point to Germany, but boy, isn't this everywhere, Ryan?
Yeah.
It's world history.
Yeah. Without question. Yeah, there's this really interesting book by a theologian named Rowan Williams. And like every theologian, Rowan Williams is a human, right? So subject his views to scrutiny like you would anybody else. But he's got this book called Christ on Trial, and it's
Hmm.
about Jesus's interviews before Pilate. And Williams points out it's very interesting that Jesus doesn't answer Pilate in one of the accounts, right? What are we to make of that? Well, Williams says, well, maybe it suggests that the kingdom of God, the language he uses is, does not compete with worldly kingdoms.
Hmm.
Uh, he's doing something different here. And he won't play the game on Pilate's terms,
Right.
right? Um, and listen, Christians for, well, 1700 years, let's call it, have thought very differently about this. So listen, I understand I represent only sort of one tradition here. And there are other ways of thinking about this that faithful Christians can adopt. But I have concerns about trying to compete on Pilate's terms,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh, that's good.
Which Jesus just refuses to do.
Yeah.
Without compromising his ultimate dominion.
Right.
Right? The dominion of Jesus is true. That's how the story ends, right? The question is, by what means? How?
Yes. 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 Yeah. And I've often thought, if Jesus wanted his followers to establish a worldly state, why didn't he kill Pilate when he had the chance?
Mm.
Like, we could have taken Jerusalem back, which seemed to be the energy that his disciples were giving him. Like, as they're marching towards Jerusalem, and the Gospels give this account, they're clamoring for worldly power. And my reading of the text is that they're thinking, yeah, we're going to kick out the bad guys. We're going to
Yeah.
take back what's ours.
At least some of his disciples, I don't think that's debatable. I mean, we know of a Second Temple Jewish group known as the Zealots, right, who are bent on expelling the Romans through military might.
Yeah,
We know this
that's right.
because they tried. They tried before Jesus and they tried after Jesus.
Yep.
And we know that one of Jesus's disciples was a zealot because he's called Simon the Zealot.
It's in the name.
It's pretty clear. Like, what's that
Yeah.
guy's deal? Oh
Yeah.
yeah, he's into being a zealot.
I love it.
And it's very interesting that some of his disciples appear to be carrying weapons, right?
Yeah.
Which suggests that they might have a different vision for how the kingdom comes.
Yeah.
And yet they're still included in Jesus's inner circle. And he's trying to show them another way without sort of expelling them, which is, I think, quite suggestive.
Yeah. And every time they feel nervous, they reach for worldly power. I mean, the Garden of Gethsemane, when the mob comes to take Jesus, Peter, his flex is my flex. It's the instinct, right? Reach for the sword. And Jesus so beautifully was like, put that away. We don't do that here. and then brought
Hmm.
healing where his own disciple had brought damage. And
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
just a beautiful image for us to meditate on. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for being with us. This was awesome. I learned how to pronounce a bunch of German names, and I really appreciate that. Where can people find you and your work?
Oh, well, I teach at Denver Seminary, so that's probably the easiest way to find me. Where
And what city is that in again?
Yep, right there in Denver.
Okay,
Yep,
the one in
yep,
Colorado.
the one in Colorado.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay,
So I teach there. I do some work on this, but I also have written quite a lot recently on the theology of work. If you want something lighter, I'm serve as the pastor of a small congregation in the Denver area called Foothills Fellowship. So if you're ever in Denver, look me up and come worship with us. We'd be glad to have you.
cool, man. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks for having me, Caleb. This is great.